Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on This Way Up, the podcast for people who are sick of everything going downhill, brought to you by the Zionist Voice. I'm your host, Ted Goldstein. And this evening, we are coming to you live from the ruins of our moral universe, watching the collapse of everything that we understand and hold dear right before our very eyes. It has been a very tough week in America and around the world. We could talk about Iran. We could talk about what's happening in the Middle East. We could talk about a lot of things. But today we are going to talk again about what's happening in Minnesota. We have to. Because what we are witnessing unfold in Minnesota is nothing short of the complete unraveling of the American moral framework and moral world. What I mean by that is that we are witnessing something that has not happened in this country since the Civil War. We are witnessing, on a political level, a true breakdown in federalism. Federalism is the way that the U.S. works, where we have a federal government and state governments and city governments, and theoretically they all work together, and they're all working towards the same goal of promoting the general welfare, promoting the public good, but there are times, of course, when states and the federal government differ. And before now, we've really only seen that in very, very minor ways. But right now, what we're seeing in Minnesota on a political level is a standoff between the federal government enforcing its policy and the state government trying to resist that policy. But the politics of what's happening in Minnesota is much less significant than the spiritual ramifications of what is happening in Minnesota. Spiritually speaking, we have a very clear issue. There's a very clear situation where you have two sides and there's legitimacy to both sides of the argument, not necessarily of the enforcement, but there's legitimacy to both sides of the argument, and the two sides have now essentially given up on the argument altogether, and they have returned to violence. So, if we think about civilization and the cities we live in and the world we live in, we are really lucky and blessed to live in a world where issues are not resolved by violence, right? We don't teach kids that when they fight with others, they can use their fists to win. We teach kids to use their words. And that simple dynamic of using your words and not your fists, that is the entire dynamic that civilization, not Western civilization, civilization period, is built on. You can't live in a society when you can't trust other people. And you can't trust other people if other people can and will resort to violence when you disagree with them. And so, what is happening in Minnesota? Clearly, we have federal agents, ICE agents, who have come into a state that is hostile to their mission. The mission of the ICE agents is to deport people who are illegally in the country. And however you feel about immigration, that is their mandate. These are federal law enforcement officers. They have a job to do, right? You can be opposed to drug enforcement policy, but if a DEA agent stops you, you have to do what they say because they are an agent of the law. And ICE agents are no different. They are also agents of the law. At the same time, they are very clearly less trained than who we are traditionally used to having enforce laws. Police officers, sheriffs, U.S. Marshals, and we all know about the hiring push to add new ICE agents recently. We know about some of the underqualifications. We know about those things. And to be perfectly honest, that's actually not that relevant when we think about the spiritual issue here. Yes, they are less well trained than other officers, but they're still officers nonetheless. You cannot resist the directive of a federal officer. You just can't do it. It's against the law. And if you do it, they can put you under arrest, and it's considered to be resisting arrest. Now, we have in Minnesota 2 killings of civilians. The killing of Renee Good and the killing of Alex Preddy. And Both of these killings are tragedies. May both of their memories be for a blessing. No one should die. No one should die, period, right? I think that it's kind of silly and almost, Pollyanna, but we as human beings should be opposed to death writ large because we should love living. And so whenever anyone dies, it is a tragedy. The two shootings are distinctly different in the facts on the ground. Meaning, after the first shooting of Renee Good, there was a massive movement on both sides to say either A, she was totally innocent, or B, she was totally guilty. And I've seen the footage from the video, and it's clear to me that it's not clear. And it's very clear to me that unless it's very clear that I don't have what it takes to adjudicate and determine who was or wasn't in the right in that situation, or what the level of danger was, or which direction her car was pointed. I can see that situation and say there's a huge level of uncertainty here. And part of being a morally independent person is being able to recognize when something is outside of your purview. It's above your pay grade. It's just not something you can actually figure out on your own. It's fine to admit that. I feel very comfortable admitting that I have no idea what was right or wrong in that situation. I only know that it was a tragedy, and I also know that the situation on the ground is a dangerous one. We are playing with fireworks when we have state officials encouraging civilians to obstruct federal officers. That's a very dangerous game. And, the kids who play with fireworks grow up to be the adults without fingers. And I have to say, I think we're playing with a lot of fireworks here, both sides. Sending this many agents into a hostile city is a very dangerous decision, and encouraging civilians to resist arrest is also a very dangerous decision. And these two decisions taken together, to me, demonstrate that there are no moral authorities left. Not on the right, not on the left, not in the center. On the right, you have the president, you have Kristi Noem, you have all of the Republican senators, the pundits, whoever. And on the left, you have the governor of Minnesota, you have the mayor of Minneapolis, you have Joe Biden, the former president, you have, all of the Democratic governors, you have all of these different people who could occupy positions of moral authority right now. Any one of them could come out and say, listen, this is not safe, this is not smart, we need to come together and come up with a solution. It's a lot of people with a lot of weapons to be out in the middle of a blizzard in Minnesota. Ice is slippery, it's dangerous, visibility is low, it's cold. We could easily have someone coming out and trying to turn the temperature down, but we don't. Rather than having moral authorities who are coming and telling us to wait and to be patient and to look for our shared humanity, we have, I don't even know what you want to call them, moral pygmies who are looking at this situation with ecstasy. They're looking at this situation and they're saying, there is an incredible opportunity for me to use this moment for my benefit, for me to push my narrative onto the other side. Whether that narrative is that the federal government is moving in a fascist direction that's trying to use undercover agents to arrest American citizens, or if my narrative is that the left is fomenting a quiet revolution and rebellion against all law and authority, right? Both of those things they're just stoking the flames. And so the first problem we have is the moral collapse, right? All of the people who are supposed to be in positions of moral authority have completely abdicated that responsibility, and essentially they have joined the mob. In addition to the moral collapse, we also have a return to violence. We have a return to the idea that violence can adjudicate our spiritual debates, right? I have been alive since 1998. I have not once seen or heard someone win the immigration argument. there are two sides to the argument, as I understand it, as I think anyone understands it. On the one hand, immigration is a powerful force for good and for change in the United States. My family were immigrants when we got here. Almost all American families were immigrants when they got here. And the immigrant families in the United States build phenomenal lives. They become Americans. They wave the American flag. They contribute to the economy, right? They're some of the hardest working people in the country. Immigration is a great thing. On the other side, you have the argument that the purely economic argument, which is that the higher immigration is, the lower minimum wage is going to be. That's a positive fact. That's not a positive as in it's good. It's positive as in it's factual, that it just is true. We know this for a fact. We know that Bernie Sanders used to be opposed to immigration for this very reason. So that's the economic argument. Then you could have the practical argument, which is, well, it's one thing to bring immigrants into a country who are interested in working really hard. It's another thing when they're receiving welfare money, right? That never in my life would I have believed that 89% of an immigrant population was receiving welfare money. Just because based on my own personal anecdotal experience, all of the immigrants I knew in California, or the children of immigrants, their parents worked. Usually they worked like 2 or 3 jobs apiece. And so the idea that someone would come to the US and basically live off of the largesse of the welfare system is very upsetting to me. And it's something that I basically thought was sort of a conservative talking point for many years. I just didn't believe it. I didn't have any evidence of it. But then we saw what happened in the Somali community in Minneapolis, right? I saw that with my own eyes. I'm looking at that fraud. I live in California. I'm thinking, what percentage of the taxes that I've paid in the past 10 years have gone to funding these scams or potentially funding terrorism abroad or whatever it is? I'm concerned about that. And so I personally am of two minds about immigration. On the one hand, I recognize how beneficial it is for the country. And on the other hand, I recognize that there are some very serious structural problems with it. And I would say that since the election of Trump in 2016, the immigration argument really got stupid. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean, it became really dumb. Like, it went from being nuanced about policy to basically being immigration good, immigration bad, right? There's no, we've had 3 presidents since 2016. We had a Democrat and a Republican. And I can't really tell you what the immigration policy was for either of them. Trump talked about building a wall, but he didn't really build a wall. Talked about deporting everybody, but he didn't really deport everybody. Talked about changing our criteria to focus more on high performing and high level, like highly educated immigrants. We haven't really done that, right? The Biden administration's policy was, I don't know. I honestly, I don't know what any of the Biden administration policies were about anything. I do know, but again, and I'm pretty well read. I read as much as I can, and I don't know what's going on with immigration in the past 8 years, so I really don't feel comfortable saying one way or the other. I know that I am opposed to people coming to the U.S., taking welfare money and sending it abroad. I'm opposed to that. I am also opposed to deporting people who have been living in the country for years, who have been working and sending their kids to school. I'm opposed to deporting them as well. I'm also opposed to having an open border policy. I'm also opposed to saying build a wall every time I get afraid of anything. So I'm of two minds about this. But I'm of one mind when it comes to what I think needs to be done in Minnesota. And what I think needs to be done in Minnesota is everyone needs to take a break. We need to have a little Shabbos respite between these two sides. Just a day, 24 hours. No one in the streets. Go home. Call your family. Call your mom. Call your brother. Watch TV. Do something, right? Don't go into the streets. Can we have a 24-hour not a lockdown, but a 24 hours of peace? That's it. Can we have 24 hours where we say no ICE agents on the street, right? No protesters on the street either. 24 hours, go back to your world, go back to your life, remember what's important, And let's see if after those 24 hours, if we can't try to talk through this. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for a number of reasons, and the main reason, I think, is because all of the authorities involved, all of the political players in this situation, benefit from the chaos. I think that Tim Walz and Jacob Frey are feeling ecstatic. Maybe ecstatic is not the right word, but I have very little faith in any politician's humanity at this point. So from a political perspective, if I'm Jacob Frey or Tim Walz, nothing could be better for my political future than this. Because 2 weeks ago, I was basically under the gun and I was looking at potentially millions and millions of dollars of fraud being laid at my feet and people saying, where did this money go? Where did it come from? No one's talking about that right now. And for the Trump administration, this is basically proof of exactly what they have been trying to say for years, which is that the left is promoting violence. The killing of Alex Preddy is putting some serious questions into that narrative because it's so clear that this was a wrongful killing. And I mean, we could find out the information later on that proves actually that it was not wrongful, that there was a legitimate concern that the police officers had. But for right now, it seems that that's not the case. But more broadly, if you think about, I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and we were talking about Trump's theory of mind. Where is he coming from? How does he understand the world? And people on the left, I think, tend to just assume that he has no theory of mind. Because to think like Trump or to try to get into his head is so odious to them that they just won't do it. That's a huge mistake. Everyone has a theory of mind. Everyone has an understanding of themselves and their world and their role in that world and what they're doing there. Right? And I believe that Trump's theory of mind, especially post-assassination, is that Trump doesn't care at all about the Constitution or our Republican form of government or our Republican institutions. He might not have even read the Constitution, and I think he would probably admit to that. And he certainly doesn't take any pride in his constitutional knowledge. I think that Trump sees himself as a Julius Caesar-like figure who comes into the world at the time when the American Republic is falling apart because of the moral collapse of the political leaders on both sides who are supposed to be leading. And he, Donald Trump, has been sent by God to save the country. And the only thing that stands between country and a complete moral collapse is him. This is his theory of mind. And I believe the assassination attempt that came within 2 inches of taking his life would have perfectly proved this to him. The reception he received in Israel for bringing the hostages home would have confirmed this for him. The way that the Iranian people are rising up against the most oppressive regime in the world would have confirmed this for him, right? There are all of these things that kind of are certainly adding to Trump's understanding of the world, at least as I understand it. And so, maybe innocent people will die. This is him thinking. Certainly innocent people will die, actually. But it's the only way to prevent the United States from complete systemic collapse. It's the only way to prevent the U.S. completely falling to the dogs. And so, like Julius Caesar, he has come to save the Republic by destroying it. He is willing to subvert any laws, any constitutional prohibitions in the pursuit of saving the country from itself. That is how I believe he understands the situation. And I believe that we're seeing on the right a schism because there are MAGA Trump people who do believe that he is this messianic-like figure. And there are also MAGA and Trump people who are looking at this and they're thinking, he's right about what's wrong in the country, but he might be wrong about the remedy. The remedy for our moral collapse might not be an amoral Trump presidency. It might be something else. But he's coming into this world, and he's looking around. You see an entirely blue state like Minnesota, where you have top to bottom Democratic leadership and you have hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud unfolding at the beginning of the year. And then immediately after that, Trump starts to send more ICE agents into Minneapolis, which I suppose in theory should have been to basically deport the illegal immigrants who were committing the fraud. That to me, that would make the logical sense. Okay, we have clear evidence that there's immigration fraud happening. We'll send immigration officers into the state to deal with that. It's not really clear, based on what I've been seeing, that that's actually what their mandate was. I mean, I am having a very hard time getting any news from on the ground in Minnesota that I feel like is remotely trustworthy. And there's something much more dangerous that's happening here, though. And I think it's that we have embraced political violence as a means to an end, and we are having political inversion. Political inversion is what happens when you have two sides of any political dispute, right or left, Whig, Tory, communist, fascist, whatever it is, and they have a set of guiding beliefs. And political inversion is what happens when, in order to win some kind of political prize or gambit or whatever, the sides will switch their core principles in order to win that dispute. Here's an example. Which side of the American political aisle supports gun ownership? Which side is the one that is adamant that owning guns is an American right, that it should not be infringed upon by any means, that concealed carry, open carry, whatever it is, those are the things that preserve American liberty. That is the right. If someone were killed by law enforcement who was legally owning a concealed firearm, as Alex Preddy was, who had it on his person, there should be no reason to look into his gun ownership as a reason for him to have gotten shot, right? We support American citizens owning concealed weapons. That's the right. And so if we support them owning concealed weapons, when someone who owns a concealed weapon is killed, we need to be the people who are defending the right to own concealed weapons. But that's not what the right has done. The right has come out and said, no, he was brandishing the gun, it was unsafe, it was causing the threat to the officers. And again, from what I have seen, that's clearly not the case. My eyes could deceive me, but unless I see evidence that he was pulling out the gun, that the gun was out, you have no reason to shoot an American citizen who's carrying a concealed. By contrast, the left has been saying for years that gun laws make people less safe. The presence of guns in situations makes things less safe. They've been arguing against concealed carry. They've been arguing for all kinds of gun regulations. And so someone bringing a concealed weapon to a protest is something that I think a lot of people on the left would object to. To me, it seems like it makes the situation a lot less safe, right? If we're all going to be protesting, once you bring a gun into the mix, we've got a whole new element of danger here. And there was an issue in the last time that Minnesota had these problems in 2020 or 2021 when Kyle Rittenhouse went into Minneapolis and started shooting protesters. And there was a huge objection to this. The side's relationship with guns has inverted because this situation makes it more advantageous for the right to be anti-concealed weapon and more advantageous for the left to be pro-concealed weapon. And that political inversion means that there's no moral integrity to either side. They're not morally consistent anymore. It's one thing if you're going to tell me, I hate immigrants, I love guns, I love freedom, I love this, that, and the next thing, and then someone gets shot by a police officer and you say, that's wrong, that was a true American citizen who was just owning a gun. Like, that's a morally consistent position. But when you start to see this amount of moral inconsistency, you should be very concerned. Because someone who is not willing to maintain consistency within their own moral worldview is certainly not going to keep consistency with you and any external force. Someone who's willing to lie to themselves in the process of winning a political battle. We'll lie to anybody for any reason, right? And now we are basically escalating in the rhetoric. We have both sides referring to the other side as terrorists. We've had people from DHS calling Alex Preddy and the protesters, revolutionary Marxist terrorists. And now we have Gavin Newsom calling, ICE officers state-sponsored terrorism. Although when Ben Shapiro interviewed him, he walked it back immediately. But again, the reason you say that is to incite people. The reason you walk it back immediately is because you don't believe it. So if you do that, you're basically just creating incitement. Of course, those of us who are following the school protests and all of the anti-Zionist rioting and rallying, whatever you want to call it, this is not surprising. The most clear thing to me about those protests, what I was really watching and seeing, was that the students did not understand the stakes of their behavior. There were students who broke the law and then were seemingly shocked that they were getting arrested. And they had no idea that occupying a college building was against the rules, was against the law. They might have known that it was against the rules, but they did not know that there were consequences for it. And I always had the sneaking suspicion that the real power behind these rallies and these riots were the professors. You have these professors, tenured professors, the most secure people in the entire world, who are encouraging their students to go out and break the law and protest and do all of these things. And I always had the suspicion that the professors were not giving the students the truth. They were not telling the students about what was at stake and what could happen to them as a result of doing this. And the professors were not the ones who lost their jobs, who were doxxed, who ended up in jail. The professors were the ones who continued teaching. And now they're silent on Iran because who cares, right? They keep going. The ones who got caught are stuck. And I remember that there were a number of infographics that I saw that came out. And pictures of things that were distributed by some of the Columbia protesters about how to resist arrest. And I forget what they called it, but it was basically how to prevent someone else getting arrested. They had a nice euphemism for it. And there were these little diagrams of like a police officer arresting someone, and then the different kinds of movements you could do to prevent that arrest. Now, the movements that they were talking about were physically assaulting that officer, right? Like, was it a strong assault? Not really. I mean, they weren't talking about like punching the officer in the face, but what they were talking about was like breaking up the officer's hand from the arrested person's hand. They talked about, basically like putting your body on the officer's body to prevent them from doing their job. Now, I was reading that and I was like, someone's going to get killed doing this, right? Because there was nowhere in the packet that said anything about what the crime was that you were then committing, right? What the number of years you could expect in jail for that are. And like, if you put your hand on a police officer, my understanding is that you're committing a very serious felony. And I wonder, because also when I was in college, the majority of the police officers who I would have interacted with were actually public safety officers for the university. And they had a way different kind of mandate than a city police officer or a federal agent. And they were pretty soft on us, right? And the university, for the most part, didn't want people getting arrested and getting their lives ruined, right? This is Princeton. No Princetonian goes to jail. And if he goes to jail, he doesn't go to prison, right? And so you want to kind of sweep these things under the rug. And so I remember thinking, I was like, they might not get killed at school, right? I don't think that a public safety officer is going to draw a weapon on a student in any situation. If the student themselves has a weapon, maybe, but public safety officers are not really trained for that. But imagine the student who was receiving all of this stuff at the encampments, who was reading all of this paperwork and propaganda and the how-to modules on how to get rid of, how to end an arrest. That person graduates from Columbia and they move to Chicago, right? And they're working their job and they're doing their thing and they're in their liberal world. And then they see that there are all of these ICE officers who are coming to Minneapolis. And this is a trained person over here. This is a trained protester. They went to Columbia. They were in the encampment. They remember when all of this stuff went down. They did some of the occupying in the building. They know how to break up arrests. So why wouldn't they drive over to Chicago to prevent ICE officers from making an arrest? Because it would be just like what they did in Columbia. Maybe it's a little colder, right? Maybe the officers are wearing a little bit of a different outfit, but it's got to be the same thing. What's the difference between me occupying a building on my university campus, preventing law enforcement officers from coming on campus, preventing Jews from going to classes? What's the difference between me doing that and me stopping an ICE officer from arresting an illegal immigrant? I don't know. I don't know what the difference is. And so I think that what we're seeing in a lot of ways is the macro ramifications of not doing anything about the school riots. We let there basically be 2 years of young people, teenagers, kids, whatever you want to call them. We let them just run amok and do whatever they wanted, and there were almost no consequences for them. And we've basically taught them that they live in a consequence-free world. And of course, when you have leaders who are abdicating their moral authority, you have politicians who are unwilling to do anything that's going to be righteous, why would anyone think that they needed to be? Why would anyone believe in consequences? Why would anyone fear consequences if you can be the governor of a state where there's $50 billion in fraud and you can keep your position? Why would I be afraid of consequences if, it turns out that the president of Harvard plagiarized her doctorate and she still keeps $1 million job? Clearly, the message I'm getting as a young person is that I live in a world without consequences. And into that world, we are now pushing more and more and more people, and we're convincing them that they can do whatever they want, and then they're going to put themselves in these dangerous situations, and it's going to be shocking and terrifying and tragic when they continue to die in these situations. And it's heartbreaking that no one cares. No one cares, right? It's not just about Renee Good and Alex Preddy, these two tragedies, these two people who lost their lives in this fight. This is so much bigger. It's about an entire it's about multiple generations, honestly, of people who have been basically taught that there are no consequences and that morality does not matter in the world. There is no right and wrong. There is only that which is convenient, politically efficient. And I just feel like we've got millions of Americans now on both sides who are basically being used as pawns in this silly game. And no one is willing to say, stop, wait, relax. Why are we killing each other? Why are we doing this? What's the point? And the inversion is sick. It's just sick. I mean, I know people who were jumping up and down when Charlie Kirk was murdered. And I know people who said that when Charlie Kirk was murdered, we needed a national day of mourning. I know people who are happy and fine with Renee Good getting murdered. And I know people who marched in the streets and said, what is happening? Enough is enough. And I can't understand how someone who would march for Renee Good would cheer when Charlie Kirk is killed. Because what's the point? What is your understanding of human life that either of these situations is not only acceptable, but is laudatory. It's great. And I see a lot of older Americans who see younger Americans behaving this way and they get disgusted. They see younger Americans cheering when Charlie Kirk gets assassinated, and they are absolutely beside themselves with rage and anger. And then some of those same older Americans see Alex Preddy get killed, and they just shrug. You know, they say, oh, he was holding a gun. This is what the administration told me, so I believe it. And it's sad. You know, it's sad because we should be morally independent people. That should be all of our goals, to become adults who can decide right and wrong for ourselves. And I'm looking around at the adults and I'm saying, what's right and what's wrong? I'm not hearing that from you. And I'm looking at the young people in my generation who are looking around and saying, there is no right and wrong. Because if there were right and wrong, someone would have told us about it by now. I'm 27 years old. Don't tell me that right and wrong exists if you're not going to show it to me. And so we are living in this situation where the adults have abdicated. The adults have abdicated their moral responsibility. And when I say adults, I mean the 50-year-olds, the 60-year-olds, the 70-year-olds, the parents and the grandparents, people who have experience, who know the way that the world works. They have abdicated all of their moral responsibility. And the young people who were born into that world, where the position of moral responsibility had been abdicated, they don't even have the language to talk about moral responsibility. They have no way of knowing that they are getting a bad deal and a bad shake from their leaders because they don't know what a good deal would look like. When was the last time we had a serious figure of moral authority in the United States? Not in my lifetime. I'll take that back, actually. Jerry Brown, the governor of California, before Gavin Newsom, was a serious moral authority, at least to me. The reason he was a serious moral authority is because he was this old crotchety man. And he came to speak when I was in youth and government. He came to speak to like 3,000 teenagers, and everyone who would come to speak to us would tell us like, you know, you're the future, the inspiration, that you're everything, you're going to save the world, yada, yada, yada. Jerry Brown stepped up. It was towards the end of his tenure, and he started talking about water. He started talking about water regulations in California and the corporations that had a vested interest in making sure that the regulations didn't go the way that they needed to go. And the reason I thought this was such a display of moral responsibility is because the speech was boring. No one was really interested. But he thought that this was the most important thing to talk about. And the reason, and Jerry Brown is also the person who balanced the California budget. He took over after Arnold Schwarzenegger when California was essentially in default. He saved the economy. He brought in a budget surplus that Gavin Newsom then promptly spent, and we're now back into a deficit. But Jerry Brown did that. When Jerry Brown was pushed on water, he restricted our water usage. And I remember people were upset, but he actually fixed the drought, right? Since Gavin Newsom took over, there have been no water restrictions in California. There have also been a lot of fires, and there have been a lot of empty reservoirs and things like that. And so I bring up this comparison to say, even I am mistaken. There were moral authorities. But Jerry Brown was also old. And so one man is not enough to convince the up-and-coming generation that moral responsibility is a serious matter. And my fear is about what comes next. Because I think that, practically speaking, the Trump administration will pull ICE officers out of Minnesota shortly. The political pressure is getting to be too great for them. They can just move them to any other state, basically. Any state where they have a reasonable suspicion of the kind of fraud that was happening in Minnesota. Like I personally, I think California is next. And I would wager, it's an interesting question if it's going to be ICE about what city they're going to go to, but I would imagine it's going to be Oakland. Oakland is a very dangerous city as it is right now. And my concern is you've got no adults in the room. You're going to go to California, which has some of the most angry and vocal young people, right? Probably going to be doing something near or around Berkeley. And I think that there will be a little bit of a pause between now and then, but then we're just going to do this whole thing over again. And I don't expect any of the adults in the room to say, stop, relax, turn the temperature down. I expect them to continue to stoke this anger and this violence. So what can we do in our own lives? Those of us who wish to maintain our moral independence, who don't want to abdicate the moral responsibility of being a human being. We can sit with this discomfort. We can sit here and say, I don't know the correct answer. I know that I'm looking at a serious amount of uncertainty in either of these situations. You're giving me two options, both of which are bad. And I can say, I am not sure about what is right, but I do know what is wrong. It is wrong to commit fraud. It is wrong to milk and abuse a system that was designed to benefit poor people. That is certainly wrong. It is also wrong to shoot Americans in the back. And I can maintain those two things. And if someone says, well, how are you going to vote during the midterms elections? I'm going to say, I don't know. I don't know. If you're going to ask me which of these two things is worse, I'm going to need to spend a lot of time thinking about that. Which of these two things is okay to me? The answer is neither. These are both unacceptable. And I probably won't vote for anyone who supports either of them, just realistically. In 2024, I voted for King David for president, and that felt great. And I might do the same thing in our midterm elections. But it's important to be able to sit with the discomfort, to look out into the world and say, this is a very confusing situation. Makes me uncomfortable, makes me stressed. I don't like it. I don't like not knowing how to feel. And I also don't like I really don't like feeling alone, right? That if I would just jump on the bandwagon and blame ICE, there would be people with me. And if I would jump on the bandwagon and blame the protesters, there would be people with me. But to stand in the middle, to say they're both wrong, and I don't know what's right, but they're both wrong, it's an uncomfortable position. But it is my position. It is where I am standing morally. I'm independent of either side and what they're telling me to do. And in my own heart and soul, I have looked at the situation and said, damn, I'm really confused. But I also know that there is a possible solution that has nothing to do with the right or the left. The solution is responsibility. It's me taking responsibility for my own behavior and my own actions. Looking at the situation and saying, you know what? There are really serious mistakes being made by the leaders on both sides. I need to learn how to not do that. How do I cultivate the strength? I'm looking at Tim Walz and I'm saying, this is a man who needs to have the strength to stand against his party and against the president and say, enough is enough. Stop protesting, stop fighting. Let's be mature. And so for myself, I want to cultivate the level of strength I think that he should have. And I'm working on that. It's not so easy. But I do know that if I want to see my nation stop backsliding on the moral slide, I myself need to move up. I need to elevate, I need to grow, I need to become stronger. And that is what I am doing. Little by little, bit by bit, every day, I am trying to be a more morally independent person who is capable of determining right and wrong for myself. And the best barometer of my moral independence is that the other people in my life are mad at me. Because if there are people who are morally dependent on their political framework, and I am independent of that framework, I'm going to make them uncomfortable. There are people who hear me and they think that I should be a Trump supporter. There are people who hear me and think that I should be a Kamala supporter. And I support neither. I am alone on this middle path. But I know that I'm on the right path because people on either side of me are telling me that it's wrong. And if I look at their paths and I say, no, your path is wrong and your path is wrong, then if they think I'm wrong, then I might be right. It's a lonely position. It's a difficult position. But I think it's the future position. That if we don't rediscover our moral sensibilities soon, we are going to be living in a world with much more violence. And we start by setting an example for everyone around us. When you stand firm and you say, I'm not going to give in to either side who's telling me what to believe here, that's when you demonstrate what it actually means to be morally strong. And people will admire your strength. They might not be able to convert right away, but they will remember that example that you set, because you are proof that everything they were told is wrong. Because everything we've been told is that morality is dead in the modern world. It's 2026. Who cares about right and wrong? I do. And I hope that you do too. So I hope that you'll join me on this journey, on This Way Up. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is This Way Up, brought to you by the Zionist Voice. I'm your host, Ted Goldstein. And as always, spread love, spread light. I'm Yisrael Chai.